I'm not your sweetheart. And you're the one being inappropriate. You can't talk to him like that.
Excuse me, young lady, calm down.
She said it without raising her voice, without moving from her seat, without a single tremor in her jaw or a flicker of fear behind her eyes. She was 11 years old, sitting in a first-class cabin at 35,000 feet, and she looked up at a grown woman in a uniform, a woman with 22 years of authority behind her name tag, and she said 6 words that made the entire cabin go silent. "You can't talk to him like that." That was it. 6 words. No theatrics. No performance. Just the plain, quiet certainty of a child who had been raised to know the difference between what is right and what is convenient, and who had decided, in that moment, on that flight, above the Atlantic Ocean, that she was not going to pretend she hadn't heard what she'd just heard. The flight attendant looked down at her. And for 1/2 second she almost smiled. The way adults smile when they think a child is being adorable by accident. The kind of smile that says, "Isn't that sweet? The little one has opinions." And then she said, "Sweetheart, sit down. The adults are talking." And the 11-year-old looked straight back up at her and said, "I'm not your sweetheart. And you're the one being inappropriate." The gasp that moved through that first-class cabin, through cream leather and low lighting and the particular hush of expensive air travel, was the kind you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. Because everyone in that cabin had been watching what was happening for the last 20 minutes. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had felt the discomfort of it sitting in their stomachs like a stone. And not one of them had said a word. Until her. But here is what the flight attendant did not know. Here is the part that changed everything. While that confrontation was unfolding, while she was standing over a 22-year-old disabled man in seat 12A and telling him, in front of a full first-class cabin, that his pre-approved, airline-documented, fully compliant wheelchair was a safety hazard, a small phone was propped against the edge of a tray table 2 rows away. And it was recording. It had been recording from the moment the tone of that conversation turned from condescension into something uglier. The person who pressed record was not a journalist, was not an activist, was not a seasoned traveler with a history of confrontation. She was an 11-year-old girl on her very first unaccompanied flight, eating a sandwich her mother had packed for her, who looked up from her library book and thought, "That's not right." Her name was Charlotte Mills. And by the time that plane landed at JFK, her name would be known by millions of people around the world. But before we get to the landing, before we get to the footage, the fallout, the firing, and the moment the internet made Charlotte Mills a symbol of something much larger than one flight, we need to go back to the beginning. Because this story, like every story that matters, did not start at the moment it exploded. It started in the quiet before. In the ordinary, unremarkable, completely normal hours that preceded the worst 20 minutes of Marcus Hale's transatlantic flight. And it started with a mother in Atlanta, Georgia, who told her daughter 2 things before she got on a plane alone for the first time in her life. She said, "Be good." And she said, "Don't let anyone make you small." Charlotte Mills was 11 years old. She was flying from London Heathrow to JFK, unaccompanied, returning from a visit to her grandmother. She had been born in Atlanta, Georgia, raised in a 2-bedroom apartment by her mother, Diana Mills, a registered nurse who worked night shifts at Grady Memorial Hospital and who had saved for 8 months to buy Charlotte that plane ticket. 8 months of overtime, of saying no to things, of doing the quiet arithmetic of a woman who works hard and loves her daughter and wants to give her the world one carefully saved dollar at a time. The ticket was not first class. Charlotte had not asked for first class. First class happened because that is the airline's standard policy for unaccompanied minors on international routes, an upgrade of care. They call it a policy designed to ensure that children traveling alone are seated where crew can monitor them most easily. Charlotte had been checked in, given a wristband, handed a small amenity kit, and walked to her seat by a gate agent who told her to enjoy the experience. She had nodded politely, settled into the seat, and pulled out a library book. In her backpack she had 4 things. A library book, a dog-eared copy of a novel she'd already read twice but liked to revisit on long journeys. A journal, a spiral-bound notebook with a blue cover that she had been filling since she was 9. A sandwich her mother had made that morning at 5 a.m. before her night shift ended, turkey and cheese, crust removed, wrapped in foil. And her phone, which had 17% battery when she boarded and which she planned to conserve because her portable charger was in the overhead bin and she didn't want to bother anyone to get it. Charlotte Mills was not a child who made a fuss. She was not a child who sought attention or manufactured drama or needed to be the loudest presence in a room. She was, by every account of everyone who knew her, a quietly extraordinary person who happened to be 11 years old. She was reading 2 grade levels above her class. She remembered conversations verbatim, weeks after they happened. She asked questions that made her teachers pause. She was the kind of child who noticed things, really noticed them, cataloged them, turned them over in her mind and examined them from every angle before she decided what she thought. Her mother, Diana, had raised her with a kind of practical, grounded wisdom that was the direct product of a woman who had seen a great deal of the world's carelessness and decided her daughter would be equipped for it. Diana Mills was not a bitter woman. She was not an angry woman. She was a clear-eyed woman who loved her daughter fiercely and who had taught her, from the time she was very small, that being good and being silent are not the same thing. That kindness and compliance are not synonyms. That you can treat everyone around you with respect and dignity and still, when something is plainly and undeniably wrong, open your mouth and say so. Don't let anyone make you small. Charlotte had heard that her whole life. She had it written on the inside cover of her blue journal in her own handwriting. She didn't think of it as a battle cry. She thought of it as instructions. Practical, ordinary instructions, the same way her mother told her to look both ways before crossing the street or to wash her hands before she ate. It was simply something you did. It was simply how you moved through the world. She had been sitting in seat 14A, reading her book, eating her sandwich, watching the clouds outside her window, when Marcus Hale had boarded. She had noticed the wheelchair first, a lightweight manual chair, clearly personalized, the frame a matte black with small engravings along the armrests that looked like they might be initials or coordinates or something deliberate and personal. She had noticed it without staring. She had looked at it the way she looked at everything, directly and without performance. And then she had looked at Marcus, who was completing his transfer into seat 12A with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, and she had given him a small nod and gone back to her book. Marcus had noticed that. He noticed it because it was unusual. Most people who saw his wheelchair did one of 2 things. They stared with the poorly disguised curiosity that they believed was invisible but never was. Or they looked deliberately away, performing a kind of aggressive indifference that was somehow worse than the staring, because at least the staring was honest. The girl in 14A had just looked, registered, moved on, like he was a person on a plane rather than a situation to be managed. He thought, interesting kid. Marcus Hale was 22 years old. He had been diagnosed with a degenerative spinal condition at 16, a diagnosis that arrived in the middle of the best swimming season of his life, when he had been ranked 3rd in his age group in the state of New York and was beginning, cautiously, to think about what competitive swimming at a collegiate level might look like. The diagnosis had not been a sudden collapse. It had been a slow unwinding. A gradual dimming of the physical capability he had spent years building, met with a gradual rebuilding of a different kind of self, one that was less about what his body could do in the water and more about what his mind could do anywhere. He was funny, in the way that people who have had to find humor in genuinely unfunny situations often are, dry, precise, a little unexpected. He was mechanically obsessive. He had rebuilt his wheelchair from component parts twice, modifying it for weight distribution and fold mechanism and grip comfort, because if you are going to use something every day of your life you might as well understand it completely. He was reading a novel when he boarded, a thick, worn paperback that he'd picked up from a second-hand bookshop in Notting Hill the day before, which he planned to finish before the plane landed. His father, Richard Hale, was, and there is no delicate way to say this, extraordinarily wealthy. The kind of wealthy that operates quietly and at a scale most people cannot visualize. Richard Hale had built his money in infrastructure technology, had spent 30 years doing it, and had reached the age of 61 with more resources at his disposal than most small countries. He was not a flashy man. He did not put his name on buildings. He did not appear on magazine covers if he could avoid it. He was powerful in the way that people are powerful when they do not need anyone to know it. Marcus had a complicated relationship with his father's wealth, or rather with the way it shaped how people treated him, which was something he could not control and did not want. He had insisted on managing his own travel. He had insisted on booking his own flights, arranging his own accommodations, filing his own accessibility requests with airlines, because those things mattered to him. They mattered because they were his. Because independence, for Marcus, was not a privilege. It was a practice, daily, deliberate, defended. His father paid for first class because the seat transfer logistics genuinely were easier, and Marcus accepted that because he was practical about the things he was practical about. What he was not practical about was being told, by anyone, that a space he had every right to occupy was somehow not meant for him. He had prearranged his wheelchair storage 2 weeks before this flight. He had spoken to the airline's accessibility team directly. He had a confirmation email with the reference number. He had the name of the team member he'd spoken to. He had done everything right, precisely because he knew that doing everything right was sometimes the only protection you had. He did not know, when he settled into seat 12A with his paperback and his headphones, that it would not be enough. That somewhere in the crew of that flight there was a woman who had decided, before she had spoken a single word to him, that his presence in her first-class cabin was a problem she needed to solve. The cabin was peaceful. That detail matters. The cabin was genuinely, beautifully peaceful in the way that transatlantic first-class cabins are designed to be: quiet, dim, unhurried. Zara, a medical student seated further back who had won a staff flight lottery and was on her first ever first-class flight, had her nose in an MCT prep book. Other passengers were on laptops, or sleeping, or staring at the small screens built into the seatbacks. Charlotte was reading. Marcus was reading. They had exchanged one moment of brief, wordless communication. Charlotte had glanced at his book cover, raised a thumb. He had raised an eyebrow back. She had gone back to her novel. It was ordinary. It was pleasant. It was exactly what a long flight should be. And then Helen Marsh walked down the aisle. 22 years with the airline. Senior flight attendant. The kind of professional seniority that accumulates not just experience but a particular quality of certainty, the certainty of someone who has decided, after 2 decades, that they know how things should work and what does and doesn't belong in the spaces they manage. Helen Marsh walked the aisle the way she always did during the early stages of a long flight, checking, assessing, noting. And she stopped when she reached the overhead space where Marcus's wheelchair was stored. She stopped. She looked at it. She looked at Marcus. She looked back at it. And something shifted in her expression that was not concern. It was not safety awareness. It was not professionalism. It was something much older and much less honest than any of those things. It was the particular expression of someone who has looked at a situation and decided, before asking a single question, that there is something wrong with it. She walked back to the galley. She spoke to her junior colleague. And then she came back. And everything changed. If you believe that speaking up, even when no one else will, is one of the bravest things a person can do, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this story is only getting started, and you are going to want to see every single second of what comes next. What would you have done if you were sitting in that cabin and heard what Charlotte heard? Tell me in the comments, would you have spoken up? Helen Marsh did not go straight to Marcus. That is the part that is important to understand. She did not walk over immediately, concern on her face, clipboard in hand, with the brisk efficiency of someone dealing with a genuine procedural issue. She went to the galley first. She stood there for nearly 3 minutes, just inside the curtain, speaking in a low voice to Derek, the junior crew member on the first-class section, in a way that involved a lot of glancing. A lot of looking towards seat 12A and then back. The kind of conversation that is not about logistics. The kind of conversation that is about building consensus, finding an ally, making sure you are not alone before you do something you already know might require justification. Charlotte noticed this. She noticed it from seat 14A, over the top of her library book, with the quiet precision of a child who has been paying attention to the world for 11 years and has therefore become very good at reading the space between what people say and what they. She noticed the glancing. She noticed the way Derek's expression moved from neutral to something more committed. She noticed Helen straightening her jacket before she walked back out. And she thought, that's not right. She did not yet know what Helen was going to do. But she knew, with the instinct that children have before the world teaches them to second-guess it, that something was coming that should not come. She lowered her book slightly. She watched. Helen approached Marcus's row under the guise of a routine check. Her voice, when she first spoke, was calibrated to a particular frequency, the frequency of professional concern, warm on the surface and clipped underneath. She asked Marcus if he was comfortable. She asked if he had everything he needed. She asked these questions in the way that questions are sometimes asked when the answers do not matter, when the questions are simply the opening move in a sequence that has already been decided. Marcus, headphones still half on, said he was fine, thanks, and returned to his book. Helen did not move. She stood there, in the aisle, next to his row. And Marcus felt it, the way you feel a presence that does not intend to leave, and he lowered his book and looked at her. She told him that she had some concerns about his wheelchair. That the storage arrangement, while she understood he had made some kind of request prior to the flight, was something she would need to verify. That in the interest of the safety of all premium passengers, she might need to make an alternative arrangement. Marcus set his book face down on the seat tray. He had heard this before. Not these exact words, but this exact shape of words. The way a concern is dressed up as policy, the way a preference is disguised as procedure. He knew the geography of this conversation. He had walked it before. He kept his voice even. He explained, precisely and without excess, that his wheelchair storage had been pre-approved by the airline's accessibility team 14 days before the flight. He had the confirmation email. He offered to show it to her. He pulled out his phone. He pulled up the email. He held it out. Helen looked at it. And then she said, I don't have any record of that on my end. Marcus kept his voice level. He told her the reference number. He told her the name of the accessibility team member he had spoken to. He told her the date and time of the call. He had not memorized these things because he expected trouble. He had memorized them because he always did, because documentation was the language that sometimes meant the difference between being heard and being dismissed. Helen said, regardless of what you were told, I have a responsibility to the safety of everyone on this aircraft. And then she said the thing that changed the temperature of the conversation entirely, the thing that crossed the invisible line between professional overreach and something more personal and more ugly. She said, there is seating at the rear of the aircraft that would be more appropriate for a situation like yours. I think you'd be more comfortable there. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He said, I paid for this seat. She said, that's not what this is about. And he said, very quietly, then tell me what it's about. She didn't answer that. She couldn't, because there was no honest answer to that question that didn't expose exactly what it was about. So instead she turned it into procedure. She talked about safety compliance. She talked about the comfort of other passengers. She used the word accommodation the way it is sometimes used, not as a kindness but as a container for condescension, a word that implies that the presence of a disabled person is itself a thing that requires managing, a thing to be accommodated rather than simply accepted. Charlotte had put her book all the way down now. She was watching directly. Her phone was still on the tray table. She picked it up. She looked at it for a moment. She had 17% battery. She did what her mother would have done. She pressed record. She set the phone back against the edge of the tray table, angled toward the aisle, and she watched. Derek appeared at the end of the row. He positioned himself just behind Helen, not doing anything specific, just present, just there, a second body lending silent weight to the first. Marcus looked at him, looked back at Helen. He asked, again calmly, to speak with the head purser. He asked with the particular restraint of someone who knows they are being pushed and who has decided that composure is the most powerful thing available to them right now. Helen told him the purser was occupied with service preparation and that she had full authority to manage a situation like this. A situation like this. Those were her exact words. A situation like this. Charlotte thought, what situation? A man. Reading a book. On a plane he paid for. Helen's language was beginning to shift. The warm professional surface was cracking and beneath it something harder was showing through. She began using different words. She called Marcus's arrangement non-standard. She called his response creating difficulty. She said, with Derek nodding slightly behind her, that she was trying to resolve this as discreetly as possible, which was, of course, already not true, because discreet is not what this was. Discreet would have been a quiet, private conversation. This was a performance. This was two crew members standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin above a 22-year-old disabled man, telling him that his presence required resolution. Every passenger in first class could see it. Some were looking. Most were looking very hard at their screens. And then Helen made the decision that turned a bad situation into something she would spend the rest of her career regretting. She turned away from Marcus. She turned to face the broader cabin, the other passengers, the witnesses, the audience she had been performing for anyway, and she said, in a voice loud enough for every seat to hear, that there was a safety concern involving a passenger's mobility equipment, and that she was taking steps to ensure the comfort and safety of all guests. It was a masterclass in coded language. She never said the wheelchair was dangerous. She never said Marcus was a problem. She used the passive, impersonal, procedural language of bureaucracy to tell an entire cabin of people that the young disabled man in seat 12A was something to be managed rather than someone to be respected. She used the language of safety to deliver something that had nothing to do with safety. And she delivered it calmly, professionally, with the composed authority of 22 years of seniority behind every syllable. And it worked, in the way that these things work, in the way that authority works when it is performed with enough confidence. The first-class cabin absorbed the announcement with the particular discomfort of people who know something is wrong but cannot find the exact procedural justification for saying so. They looked at their screens. They looked at their drinks. They did the thing that people do in these moments. They waited for someone else to go first. Marcus looked out the window, and something shifted in his face. Not anger. Not the hot, reactive flush of indignation. Something quieter and harder and sadder than that. The thing that crosses a person's face when they have been through a version of this before and they recognize, with exhausted certainty, that it is happening again. The thing that says, I did everything right and it didn't matter. The thing that has no name but that sits in the chest like weight. Charlotte saw it. She saw that exact thing cross his face. And she stood up. She was 11 years old. She was 4 feet 9 inches tall. She stood up in her first-class seat in the aisle of a London to JFK flight and she said, clearly and without wavering, you can't talk to him like that. The cabin, which had been doing a very practiced impression of not watching, suddenly stopped pretending. Every head turned. Helen turned. And for that half-second, the smile. The almost smile. The reflexive, condescending assumption that this was a child's adorable attempt at participation. Sweetheart, Helen said, sit down. The adults are talking. And Charlotte Mills, daughter of Diana Mills, student at a school in Atlanta, Georgia, 11 years old and 4 feet 9 inches tall, looked directly at the woman in the uniform and said, I'm not your sweetheart. And you're the one being inappropriate. The gasp moved through the cabin like a small wave. And then silence. The particular, dense silence of a room full of people who have just heard something that they did not expect and cannot unhear. Helen's expression changed. The almost smile was gone. What replaced it was something else, a kind of recalibration, a reorientation of hostility. Because Charlotte was not being adorable. Charlotte was not fumbling through adult language she didn't understand. Charlotte was being precise. She was identifying accurately and specifically that the person behaving inappropriately in this situation was not Marcus. And the fact that she was 11 years old did not make her wrong. It made her, somehow, more difficult to dismiss. So Helen tried a different approach. She told Charlotte that she was an unaccompanied minor, that she was traveling under special airline supervision, that disruptive behavior, and she used that word, disruptive, the same word she had used about Marcus, could be formally reported. That in extreme cases, an unaccompanied minor causing disruption on an international flight could be held at the next stop. She threatened an 11-year-old child with detention at a foreign airport for saying that a grown woman was being inappropriate. Let that land for a moment. Let that fully arrive. Charlotte did not flinch. Her hands were folded in front of her on the tray table. Her voice, when she spoke, was completely steady. She said, "My phone has been recording since you started. I have everything." Helen's eyes went to the phone on the tray table. And the color changed in her face. Not a dramatic change. Subtle, the kind that happens internally and only just reaches the surface. But it was there. And Charlotte saw it. And Charlotte held her gaze. From the second row back, an older white male passenger with gray hair and a navy jacket set down his newspaper, cleared his throat, and said, in the careful, measured tones of someone who has decided he is done staying quiet, "Leave the child alone. She's right." And then, from across the aisle, a woman's voice, "This is really inappropriate. Someone should get the purser." And then another, "The boy has documentation." He showed it to her. The cabin was no longer pretending not to watch. The cabin was watching. And it was not watching with the detached curiosity of spectators. It was watching with the particular energy of people who have made a collective decision that they have seen enough. Derek had retreated to a position further back in the aisle. The bold, implicit solidarity he had offered Helen by standing behind her had quietly dissolved. He was no longer positioned as backup. He was positioned as someone who very much wanted to not be associated with whatever was happening. Marcus was quiet. He had been quiet through Charlotte's intervention, through Helen's threat, through the passengers finding their voices. He had been looking at Charlotte with an expression that was difficult to interpret, not quite surprise, not quite gratitude, something more complicated than both. And then he reached into the pocket of his jacket and he pulled out his phone and he made a call. Low voice. 3 sentences. Then he put it away. The head purser arrived 4 minutes later. His name was James, and he had been with the airline for 16 years, and he walked into that first-class cabin with the alert, assessing manner of a person who has been told something has gone wrong and who is trying to build an accurate picture as quickly as possible. Helen met him at the entrance to the cabin. Her version of events came out fast and layered. Marcus uncooperative, Charlotte disruptive, a safety concern that was being managed until the situation escalated. She used the word aggressive. She used the phrase refused to comply. She described Charlotte as a minor who inserted herself into a crew matter. She delivered all of this with the confidence of a woman who had been doing this job for 22 years and who expected that seniority to carry weight. James listened. He looked down the cabin. He looked at Marcus, sitting quietly with his book closed on his lap. He looked at Charlotte, sitting with her hands folded and her phone on the tray table and her eyes fixed on him with the steady, patient attention of a child who has absolutely nothing to hide. He looked at the other passengers, several of whom were now looking back at him with the particular expression of people who have been waiting for competent authority to arrive. He walked down the aisle. He crouched beside Marcus first and asked him to explain, in his own words, what had happened. And Marcus did, precisely, chronologically, without embellishment, the way he'd been doing things precisely and without embellishment his whole life, because when the world decides you are a situation to be managed, precision is armor. He showed James the confirmation email. He showed him the reference number. He said the name of the accessibility coordinator he'd spoken to 2 weeks ago. Then James turned to Charlotte. He turned to an 11-year-old girl who was on her first unaccompanied flight, who had not asked to be in the middle of this, who had simply heard something wrong and said so. He asked her what she'd seen. Charlotte told him. Factual. Sequential. No emotion that wasn't earned. She said, at the end, she called him a safety concern. He has a pre-approved accommodation. I looked up the airline's accessibility policy on my phone while she was talking because I wanted to make sure I wasn't wrong. I wasn't wrong. James looked at her for a long moment. He stood up. He walked back toward the galley, pulling out his own phone as he went. And the cabin waited. This story is far from over, and what happens in the next few minutes changes everything. If you haven't already, hit subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. We tell the stories that need to be told. Charlotte looked up the airline's own policy mid-confrontation to make sure she was right before she spoke. At 11 years old. What does that say to you? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The wait was not long. James was gone for less than 3 minutes. But in the particular atmospheric pressure of that cabin, the silence, the stillness, the sense of 20 people collectively holding their breath, 3 minutes felt geological. It felt like the kind of time that exists in a different dimension than regular time. Marcus looked at the clouds outside the window. Charlotte sat with her hands folded. Helen stood near the galley entrance, arms crossed, with the expression of someone who is expecting to be vindicated and is already composing, mentally, the precise and righteous way in which they will accept that vindication. Derek had made himself as invisible as it is possible for a human being to be while still technically being present in a room. James came back with a tablet. He came back with the airline's accessibility accommodation policy loaded on the screen and with a call that he told Helen had come through the operations director's office. A call initiated, it turned out, by the executive assistant of one Richard Hale, who had been reached by his son 3 minutes ago from seat 12A, and who had in turn called the airline's head of operations before the cabin door was 3 minutes from being raised. Richard Hale, whose name meant nothing to Helen Marsh because she had not looked at the passenger manifest the way she should have. Whose name meant nothing to Derek. Whose name meant, to the airline's head of operations on a Tuesday afternoon, that he was on the phone inside 90 seconds of the call being made. James set the tablet on the empty seat beside Marcus. He showed him the screen. The pre-approval was there. The reference number matched. The accessibility coordinator's name matched. Marcus's accommodation had been not only requested but confirmed, documented, filed, and flagged as a compliant arrangement in the airline's own system 2 weeks before this flight. There was nothing irregular about it. There was nothing that required resolution. There was nothing that had ever required Helen's intervention at all. James read the confirmation aloud. He read Marcus's full name and the specific details of the pre-approval and the compliance reference number, clearly, in a voice that carried to the nearest rows. He did not do it theatrically. He did it with the calm, professional certainty of someone who is establishing facts on the record, in front of witnesses, in a way that cannot later be walked back. And then he turned around. And he looked at Helen. He said he would need to speak with her at the rear of the aircraft. He said that with the same measured, professional calm that he had used to read the compliance document. But the temperature underneath it was different. There was no warmth in it. There was nothing that could be construed as ambiguity. And Helen Marsh, who had been doing this job for 22 years, understood, perhaps for the first time in those 22 years, what it felt like to be on the wrong side of institutional authority. Her backpedaling was, in its own way, remarkable. She said she had been following procedure. She said her primary concern had always been the safety of all passengers. She said she had not been given clear information about the prearrangement before the flight. She said, and this was the word that every person within earshot heard and would remember, that it had been an honest mistake. James said, "Your procedure does not include publicly announcing a passenger's disability to the cabin. Your procedure does not include threatening an unaccompanied minor with being offloaded. What you did was not a procedural error. It was a violation of this passenger's dignity and this child's safety." He told her she was relieved of her first-class duties for the remainder of the flight. And then, in the third row of the first-class cabin on a flight from London Heathrow to JFK, someone started clapping. It was not aggressive. It was not triumphant, exactly. It was the small, relieved applause of people who have been waiting for something wrong to be named correctly and who are expressing, in the only way available to them, that they witnessed it. It spread. Not everyone joined. But enough did that the sound filled the cabin briefly, honestly, and then faded. Helen was escorted to the rear of the aircraft. Derek had already found somewhere else to be. James came back to Marcus. He crouched beside him and apologized. He used that word, apologized. Not, "I'm sorry if you felt uncomfortable," not, "I apologize for any inconvenience." He apologized for what happened. He said the airline's disability accommodation policy existed precisely to prevent situations like this one, and that it had not been upheld by the crew member involved, and that he was personally sorry that Marcus's flight had been disrupted in this way. Marcus listened. He nodded. He said quietly, "It's not the first time." James didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. Then James walked 2 rows back and crouched beside Charlotte. An 11-year-old girl who had eaten her mother's sandwich, recorded a 20-minute confrontation on 17% battery, and stood up in front of a uniformed adult who threatened to have her removed from the flight and said, without flinching, "I'm not your sweetheart." James looked at her and said, "You were very brave." Charlotte looked back at him and said, "I wasn't brave. It was just wrong." James nodded slowly. He stood up. He went back to managing his flight. Charlotte picked up her library book. She opened it to her page. And then she closed it again. She looked at the back of seat 12A, which was where Marcus was sitting, just ahead of her. And she said quietly, so only he could hear, "Are you okay?" There was a pause. Long enough that she thought maybe he hadn't heard her. Then Marcus said, "Getting there." She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. She opened her book. She read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word. Outside the window, the Atlantic rolled gray and enormous 35,000 feet below. After about 10 minutes, Marcus said, without turning around, "You didn't have to do that." Charlotte said, "I know." And then, after another moment, "My mum said don't let anyone make you small. You weren't being small. She was just trying to make you feel that way." The silence that followed was not an uncomfortable one. It was the specific, particular silence of 2 people sitting in adjacent space and understanding each other without needing more words. Marcus turned back to his window. Charlotte opened her journal. She uncapped her pen and she wrote something in it. She wrote it in the careful, deliberate handwriting of someone who wants to remember exactly how something felt. The cabin hum returned. Even and low and vast. The first-class cabin settled back into the particular quiet it was designed for. The cream leather, the low lighting, the curated hush. Only now it felt different. Not tense. The tension was gone, resolved, named, and dealt with. But different. The way a space feels different after something real has happened in it. After honesty has moved through it and left a residue that politeness cannot fully clean. 3 hours later, the plane began its descent into JFK. Zara, the medical student who had been quietly recording from her seat toward the back of the first-class section, caught Charlotte's eye as they gathered their bags from the overhead bins. She asked Charlotte's permission, asked a child's permission, before she said anything about the footage. Charlotte thought about it for a moment. She said she would need to call her mum first. At the gate, Charlotte called Diana. Diana answered on the second ring, the way she always did when Charlotte was traveling alone. Charlotte told her what had happened. She told her methodically in the right order, with all the details in their correct places. She told her about Marcus and about Helen and about standing up and about James and about the applause at the end. Diana was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Are you okay?" Charlotte said she was fine. Diana said, "I'm proud of you." Charlotte said, "I know, Mum." Diana said, "I'll see you at baggage claim." And Charlotte ended the call and picked up her backpack and walked through the gate at JFK and into the rest of her life. If this story is moving you, if Charlotte's 6 words gave you chills, hit that subscribe button right now. We're not done yet. What happens next is the part that changed everything. Marcus said, "It's not the first time," when the purser apologized. What do you think it costs a person to have to say that? Tell us in the comments. Zara posted the footage that evening. She had spent 2 hours thinking about it. She is not, by nature, someone who moves quickly in situations that require judgment, and the gravity of what she was holding in her camera roll was not lost on her. She had footage of a grown woman in uniform threatening a disabled passenger and then threatening the child who intervened. She had Helen's face. She had Helen's voice. She had the words, every one of them, clear, unambiguous, with the background hum of a first-class cabin providing a terrible kind of ambient clarity. She had Diana's number, given through Charlotte at the gate. She called first. She explained who she was and what she had. Diana listened carefully and asked 2 questions, whether Charlotte's face was visible in the footage, and whether Charlotte had said anything she wouldn't want her school to see. Zara said yes to the first question and no to the second. Diana said, "Post it." The caption was 7 words. It named the airline. It said, "This happened in first class today." Nothing else. No hashtags. No call to action. No dramatic preamble. Just the footage and 7 words and a time stamp. It was live by 9 p.m. By midnight it had 400,000 views. By 3 a.m. it had crossed 2 million. By the time Zara woke up the next morning, it had been shared by accounts she had never heard of on platforms she barely used, and her phone was generating notifications at a rate she had never experienced and found, in a word she would later use in an interview, bewildering. The reason it spread was not complicated. The footage was undeniable. There was no angle from which Helen Marsh looked like anything other than what she was. A woman in authority using that authority against a disabled passenger and then using it against a child to silence the witness. You could hear the exact moment Charlotte stood up. You could hear Helen say, "Sweetheart." You could hear Charlotte's response. You could hear the catch in Marcus's voice when he said, to the purser, "I showed her the email and she wouldn't look at it." You could hear all of it, because Charlotte's phone had been recording from 2 rows away with the cabin hum as clean acoustic background, and every word was clear. The internet, when it encountered the footage, did what the internet does when it encounters something undeniable. It became very loud, very fast, in multiple directions at once. The disability rights community amplified it first. Organizations, advocates, and individuals with mobility conditions who recognized, with an exhausted and specific familiarity, exactly what Marcus had experienced. The pre-approved accommodation ignored. The polite insistence treated as aggression. The demand to move to the back. They had seen this. Many of them had lived this. They knew the shape of it before they'd seen every second of the footage. Then it was Charlotte's 6 words. "I'm not your sweetheart." That phrase moved separately from the rest of the video. It clipped out, it traveled, it became a text graphic on the accounts of people who had never heard of this story and who encountered the quote cold and then went looking for the context. Which meant they found the video. Which meant the numbers kept climbing. Helen was identified within 18 hours. Social media, in the way that it does this, moved efficiently. Her full name surfaced first on a thread that gathered her airline employee ID from a visible badge in one frame of the footage. Then her accounts were found. Then her employer was tagged. Then her employer's employer. The airline's corporate communications team received a volume of contact in the first 24 hours after the video went live that their crisis management protocols were not built to handle with any comfort. The airline's statement came on the morning of the second day. It was formal and careful and followed the established grammar of corporate crisis communication, expressing that the behavior depicted was inconsistent with the airline's values, that an investigation was underway, that the passenger experience described was not representative of their standards. It confirmed, without naming her, that the crew member involved had been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. 3 days later, terminated. The airline also published a full restatement of their disability accommodation policy, linked to a dedicated customer support line for accessibility concerns, and announced a mandatory crew training review. None of these things happened spontaneously. All of them happened because 2 million, then 5 million, then 9 million people watched a video and arrived at a collective conclusion and expressed that conclusion loudly enough to be heard by the people who make institutional decisions. Marcus's identity surfaced on day 3. A journalist connected the dots. The airline manifest, the accessibility pre-approval reference, the name James had read aloud in a cabin of 20 witnesses. Marcus Hale. And then, Richard Hale. And then the story shifted, in the way that stories sometimes shift when money enters them, toward a different center of gravity. The coverage began to emphasize the billionaire angle. The headlines grew more interested in the question of whether Marcus's father's intervention had accelerated the outcome, whether the call to the operations director had been the decisive moment rather than Charlotte's footage or the purser's investigation. There were opinion pieces. There were counter-takes. The conversation about disability accommodation and airline policy, which had been the central thread for the first 48 hours, found itself competing with a parallel conversation about wealth and access and whether justice that arrives by private plane is really justice at all. Marcus gave one statement. He posted it on his own social media account, which he had not previously been active on, in a single photograph of a handwritten note. It said, "My chair. My seat. My right." That's the whole story. That photograph had more engagement than anything his father's company had ever published. Charlotte's mother released a statement through a family friend who was a communications professional and who helped Diana write it the way it needed to be written. It said, "My daughter was taught right from wrong. That's all that happened on that plane." But the internet had already decided that Charlotte was more than a child who knew right from wrong. She was, in the vocabulary that viral moments generate, a symbol. She was being called brave, being called extraordinary, being called a hero. Her face, 11 years old, composed, hands folded on a tray table, looking steadily at a woman who had just threatened her, was everywhere. There were news segments. There were think pieces. There were tribute accounts created in her name. Charlotte Mills, who had been trying to conserve her phone battery, was a global news story. The disability rights community and child advocacy organizations both used the moment to amplify longer conversations that had been ongoing for years. Disabled passengers routinely experiencing prearranged accommodations being ignored or reversed by individual crew members. The gap between what an airline's accessibility policy states and what a passenger actually experiences at seat level. The research showing that Black children in public confrontations are disproportionately assessed as older, as more threatening, as less worthy of protection, and what it means that Charlotte had spoken up knowing, at 11 years old and with whatever instincts 11-year-olds carry about how the world works, that she might face consequences for it. Everyone talked about the billionaire's son, one disability advocate wrote in a widely shared piece. Almost nobody asked what Charlotte calculated before she stood up. She had calculated something. Of course she had. She was 11 years old and she was Black and she was alone on a plane and a woman in uniform had just told her that speaking up could get her removed from the flight. She had done the arithmetic of that, quickly, instinctively, in the way that children who are raised to understand the world as it is rather than as it ought to be learned to do, and she had decided that the arithmetic still came out on the side of speaking. Her mother's voice, "Don't let anyone make you small." She hadn't. And the whole world was watching. Subscribe if you believe that the most important voices in a room are sometimes the ones you least expect. Charlotte didn't ask to be a symbol, she just refused to be silent. Don't miss what happens next. Charlotte became a global symbol almost overnight, but her mother's statement was just 8 words. "My daughter was taught right from wrong." What does that say about how Diana raised her? Comment below. 2 weeks after the video posted, Helen Marsh created a new social media account. Her previous accounts had been deactivated, not deleted, deactivated, which is the digital equivalent of drawing the curtains and hoping no one knocks. The new account had a different username. No profile photograph. One post. It was an apology. It ran to 4 paragraphs. It had been written, and this was evident to anyone who has read enough public apologies to recognize the grammar of legal consultation, by someone whose primary concern was minimizing exposure rather than expressing genuine remorse. It used the phrase, unconscious bias, which is a real and important concept that this statement was using as a liability shield. It said she had never intended harm. It said she was committed to education and growth. It said she recognized the impact of her behavior without specifically naming what that behavior had been or what the impact had cost the people it was directed at. It was careful in the way that documents written by lawyers are careful. It was precise in the way that evasion is sometimes precise. Neither Marcus nor Charlotte responded. Not publicly. Not privately so far as anyone knew. Diana Mills was asked about the apology in a brief interview she gave to a journalist she trusted a week after it was posted. She was asked if Charlotte had seen it. Diana said yes. She was asked how Charlotte had responded. Diana said, "She read it. She closed the tab. She went back to her homework." The journalist asked if Diana thought Charlotte should respond. Diana said, "My daughter is 11. She doesn't owe that woman a response." The journalist asked if Diana felt the apology was genuine. Diana looked at the journalist for a moment and then said, "An apology that arrives under pressure, through a lawyer, on a new account, with no acknowledgement of what she actually did, that's damage control. That's not contrition." She said it without anger. She said it the way she said most things, plainly and from a place of certainty that did not require decoration. The interview was brief. Diana went back to her night shift. Charlotte went back to school in Atlanta, where she had become, slightly against her will, an interesting person to know. Her classmates had seen the footage. Her teachers had seen the footage. The school counselor had called Diana to check in. A local news crew had appeared outside the school gates one morning and been asked, firmly, to leave. Charlotte was recognized in the grocery store. She was approached at the library by strangers who wanted to tell her she was brave. She was polite to all of them. She said thank you. She moved on. But Diana noticed things. She noticed that Charlotte was quieter in the months after the flight. Not sadder. Charlotte was not a sad child, and she had not been traumatized by what happened in the way that a less prepared child might have been. But more watchful. More aware of how people looked at her in public spaces. More conscious of the gap between how she moved through the world before that flight and how she moved through it now, as someone who had learned, at 11, that speaking the truth out loud in a public space has a price, and that the price is not always visible in advance. She still wrote in her journal. Every day still. The blue spiral notebook was nearly full by the time she came back from London, and she started a new one, green this time, with her name on the inside cover in the same careful handwriting. Marcus still flew. He still prearranged his accommodations. He still had the name of the accessibility coordinator he'd spoken to. He had a new name now, a new contact, a new confirmation email with a new reference number, because that is the work. That is the ongoing, perpetual, unglamorous work that doesn't appear in viral footage and doesn't generate global think pieces and doesn't trend on any platform anywhere. That is just the reality of moving through a world that was not designed with you in mind and that requires you, every single time, to prove your right to be in it. He and Charlotte stayed in contact. That is true, and it is mentioned simply, without dramatization, because it is a small inhuman detail in a story that had become very large and very inhuman in the way that viral stories do. Two people who sat near each other on a plane, one of whom chose to act when no one else would. They stayed in contact. That is the whole of it. Marcus said, in the one additional public comment he ever made about the incident, a brief response to an accessibility advocate's post, months later, that what he remembered most was not Helen. Not the confrontation. Not the applause when she was removed, or the purser's apology, or the confirmation document read aloud. What he remembered most was a voice from 2 rows back. Completely certain. Saying 6 words that no one else in that cabin had said. Helen Marsh had looked at a wheelchair and seen a problem. She had looked at seat 12A and decided that the young man sitting in it was something to be managed and moved and made smaller. She did not see a swimmer. She did not see someone who had rebuilt his own mobility equipment with his own hands because he understood every component of it and believed that understanding was a form of ownership. She did not see someone who had memorized a confirmation email and a reference number and a coordinator's name because he knew that precision was the only armor that sometimes worked. She looked at him and she saw a situation. She saw something that did not, in her assessment, belong where it was. She was wrong. The recording proved it. The compliance document confirmed it. The purser named it. The airline acknowledged it. But Marcus still has to explain his wheelchair every time he boards a plane. Still has to produce the email. Still has to say the reference number. Still has to do the work of justifying his presence in the space he has already paid for and confirmed and arranged and documented, because the world does not change its habits on the basis of one viral video, however undeniable. The individual consequence arrived. The institutional habit continues. And Charlotte Mills, who is, as of this telling, still 11 years old and still writing in her green journal, learned something on that plane that her mother had tried to teach her without burdening her with too early, that being willing to speak does not protect you from the cost of speaking. That the price is real. That you pay it anyway, if you are the kind of person who pays it, and that being that kind of person is not a performance of courage. It is not a moment. It is a choice that renews itself, quietly, every time the moment comes. Helen Marsh saw a wheelchair. She saw a child. She decided what both of those things meant before she asked a single question. She was armed with 22 years of authority and the assumption that her version of the world was correct. She had no idea that a phone was recording. She had no idea who was on the other end of the call being made quietly from seat 12A. She had no idea that the child she dismissed as a sweetheart would one day be quoted in newspaper headlines around the world. The recording proved her wrong. But nothing, no footage, no viral moment, no corporate statement, no mandatory training review, nothing erases the fact that Marcus Hale spent 20 minutes in a first-class cabin being told that his presence there required resolution. Nothing erases what that does to a person. What it costs. What it asks of you to remain calm and precise and documented and correct in the face of it, to maintain your dignity in the space where someone is trying to strip it from you, to not give them what they're looking for. And nothing erases the fact that a child, an 11-year-old girl on her first solo flight, eating a sandwich her mother packed, 17% battery on her phone, was the only one in that cabin who decided that the cost of speaking was worth paying. She was not trying to be a symbol. She was not trying to go viral. She was not trying to be anyone's hero. She was just a girl whose mother told her not to let anyone make her small, sitting in a first-class cabin watching someone try to make a man small, and deciding, quickly, clearly, without drama, that she was not going to pretend she hadn't seen it. That was it. That was the whole story. That is what 11 looks like when it's been raised right. And Helen Marsh, who had 22 years of experience and an airline uniform and an institutional position and every structural advantage available to her in that moment, looked at Charlotte Mills and said, "Sit down, sweetheart." She had absolutely no idea who she was talking to. If this story moved you, if Charlotte's choice to stand up while everyone else sat down says something to you about the world we live in and the people we need to be, please subscribe. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These stories matter. The people in them matter. Thank you for watching. Charlotte wrote in her journal that she wasn't trying to be brave, she just didn't want him to be alone in it. What do you think those words mean? And what would you want to say to Charlotte if you could? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one.